FDR and the Jews, Part 2. This is, without any doubt, when you talk about American Jewish history, the role FDR played in the Holocaust, during World War II, leading up to the Holocaust, from when it came to issues of rescue, relief for the Jews of Europe, is by far the most complex, controversial, and nuanced area of American Jewish history, without question. Some people love FDR. He's extremely popular, just in the general population, and particularly in the Jewish population. Now, his stock is going down just a little bit, but wherever it ends up, doesn't really change the fact that certainly at the time, as we discussed before the class started, he was beloved by the Jewish community. As we mentioned, in all 4 elections that he won, he never received less than 80% of the Jewish vote. So whether we love him or condemn him, which I will, largely, but you know, it should be noted he is a very complex person. One thing is for sure, you love him or hate him. We actually just read in last week's Torah portion the story of Noah and the flood. The great author of Slobodka points out, you will find, we actually read it in the Haftorah last week, that the flood is called the Mei Noach, the flood of Noah, as if to say that Noah bore some of the responsibility for the catastrophe that was the flood, which is very strange. We know the people of that generation were evil, horrible, wicked, terrible, and Noach was Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'doro savas halim izalach Noach. Noach was pious. He was righteous. He was a good person. He was a great person. He was righteous. He was an amazing person. So in what sense was he accountable? And the Medrash says is that Noach, of course, yes, he was an incredibly righteous person, but he didn't pray for his generation. And the great author of Slobodka says, wait a minute, that can't mean what it sounds like at face value. You mean to tell me that Noach didn't pray for the salvation of his generation? Of course he did. We know everything about Noach's background, his life, who he was as a person. He cared desperately about the people of his generation. Of course he prayed. So what do you mean he didn't pray and he's therefore held accountable? And the great author of Slobodka explained what it means is, of course he prayed, but it means he didn't pray enough. He didn't do everything that he could have done. And because he didn't do everything that he could have done and should have done, he bears some responsibility. Not all responsibility, but you can't call him innocent. He bears some of the guilt. I think that is a very apropos way to introduce FDR and the Jews and how he dealt with the catastrophe that was the Holocaust. Whether you love him, you hate him, or whatever it may be, one thing is for sure, he definitely did not do enough. And in that sense, he's going to bear responsibility. That said, what I'd like to do, when it comes to FDR and the Jews, the trouble is, it's very easy to just say he was an evil person, he didn't do everything that he could. He was the president during the greatest calamity in the history of humanity, and he obviously didn't do enough, so just by simple association, just by that reality, let's condemn him. Or you could take the other approach, if you were like the 80% of American Jews at the time, who loved him and worshipped him and cheered him, and they would argue they would say, well, wait a minute, you want to condemn him? Really? A couple of things. You do realize that he did more than any world leader in terms of rescue and relief of the Jewish community. And that is correct. For example, the War Refugee Board, which hopefully we'll get to at the end of the conversation, he saved over 200,000 Jews by most estimates. He was very proud, and he was the one who put together the Evian Conference, which was a legitimate conference for rescue and relief. Very important is to, and this is going to bump into our conversation a little bit later. You also have to remember, okay, we're going to slam FDR. Okay, that's great. You do realize that the alternatives were significantly worse. If we think that FDR didn't do as much as he could have, again, that may or may not be true. One thing is undebatable, is the Republican Party at the time were even more nativist and isolationist than were the Democrats. So it's not so easy to simply say he was bad, he was good. And actually what I'd like to do tonight, and if we end up having to do a part 3 to this, I guess everyone will just have to come back in a couple of weeks or whenever it is. I'm generally speaking, because FDR has been, there's so much has been written about him. So many opinions. David Wyman, I would suggest, if anyone really wants to read the most critical works, The Abandonment of the Jews, Paper Walls by David Wyman is going to be your #1 book. Very, very, very critical. There are many other biographies that, well, obviously any biography of FDR will touch on his role in the Holocaust, but the books that really focus on FDR's relationship, the most recent book that's really received the most attention is this one right here by Richard Brighton and Alan Lichtman, aptly called FDR and the Jews. They take and I'm going to pretty much use them as an outline for my discussion because I like their approach. They take a very balanced approach by not just sweeping him as being all good or all bad. The truth of the matter is none of us are like that. It's hard to reduce. FDR is probably the most complex person to ever occupy the White House. To simply reduce him as good, bad, hero, villain, you've missed the nuance, and there was never one as nuanced as FDR. So the only way to really go about trying to assess FDR is actually go through the details. And you're not going to come up with a single answer. As a matter of fact, what they're going to point out, and this is what we're going to do for tonight's class to see how far we get, they actually categorize, I think it's a very smart way of doing it, they categorize FDR's responses to the tragedies in Europe into 4 major epochs, 4 periods of FDR's presidency. It's not going to correspond to his 4 terms, but they kind of roughly do. But they're going to break it up into 4 different approaches, and he acted very differently for very explainable reasons during each one of these periods. And we're going to end up with a bit of a challenge. And that's actually quite apropos, because FDR was an incredibly complicated person. Those 4 categories, I'll briefly outline them now, and then we're going to go through them. It's from the beginning of his first term. It's really his first term, from 1932, 1933 till 38, where he's completely indifferent. He's basically completely indifferent, only focused on domestic affairs. His second term until 41, or really 42, to the entry of the war, where he's actually very, very interested and focused on relief and rescue. You have the beginning of the war till 44, and then you have the end of his life, 44 to the end, where he's actually quite, in some respects, quite heroic. The problem is he's confusing. He's a complicated person. That's who FDR was. And then I'll, at the end, time permitting, and again, if not, we'll do it next class, we'll maybe go through some of the misconceptions, and there are many misconceptions that Brightman, Lichtman, and others really highlight that are popularized in American mythology of some of the guilt that FDR has for the catastrophe of European Jewry, and then maybe I'll offer some of my own thoughts. It's absolutely remarkable historically is the parallel between Hitler, the rise of Hitler, and FDR. They were in power, I don't want to say to the day, but virtually to the week. You know, Hitler rises to power, and again, he becomes chancellor in 30, then 33, and then the Reichstag fire. He becomes the chancellor. He takes dictatorial powers in March of 33. That's when FDR is inaugurated. So it's the same month, and of course, FDR is going to die in, when is it? Beginning of April of 45. Hitler dies a few days later. So they're virtually completely overlapped in terms of their power. It's really quite remarkable. Of course, when Hitler rised to power, immediately after that, Nazis began harassing Jews publicly. 7 weeks after his rise to power, the first concentration camps open. Though the atrocities that were committed, again, if you just know it's actually maybe helpful. I'm going to go out of order. Just in terms of understanding the very, very brief overview of the Holocaust, just to make sure dates and chronology are accurate. I always, in my mind, I divide the Holocaust into 4 periods. You have the rise of Hitler in 33 until Kristallnacht of 38. For those first few years, Jews were not. There was violence, but it was mainly social ostracization. They were kicked out of jobs. It was basically political, economic, and social persecution. That was again, there was violence, but that wasn't the main persecution. It was mainly social, economic, and political isolation. After Kristallnacht, when is that? November of 38. That's when you begin seeing some where it ramps up to physical violence. It's not the beginning of the Holocaust. There's no final solution. It's not extermination. It's just, I mean, people are killed, and it's horrific beyond belief. But it's not yet the mass exterminations. That doesn't begin really until June of 41, when Hitler invades Russia. Once Hitler invades Russia, again, the war begins in September 39, but it wouldn't be until really till the summer of 41. That's when you have the Einsatzgruppen killings, which were the mobile killing units. That's really when the extermination begins, but that's when the inefficient local murder, roughly speaking, about 1 million Jews are killed in the Einsatzgruppen, and it wouldn't be really till January of 42, that's when the final solution kicks in. So keep in mind, the actual planned extermination of the Jews is a very short amount of time. And that's very important. There's years and years and years of buildup that leads up to it. Now, when it comes to early on, and this is a bit of a misconception, people didn't talk about it. That's incorrect. It was in the media. It was discussed. It was very front and center what was happening in Germany in terms of the social persecutions. And even after Kristallnacht, it was heavily covered by the media. What wasn't covered by the media, we'll get to later in our discussion, would be the mass exterminations. That stuff was very much, we'll talk about how that was, when that was known, how that was known, and all of that. But for the first 2 phases of the Holocaust, everything was out in the open. Although the Nazis tried hiding as much as they could have, it was definitely covered. It was not whitewashed by the media. Of course, in the election of 32, when FDR rises to power and Hitler's also at the rise to power, Hoover, who's running on the Republican ticket, even after he loses the election, when that lame duck presidency, when he's in between the election and the inauguration, he wants to come up with FDR with a joint statement condemning and decrying all of Hitler's rhetoric and the atrocities that are beginning to happen. But FDR wouldn't. He wouldn't sign any kind of joint declaration. Why not? Because Hoover was a loser, because this is the middle of the Great Depression. And FDR wanted to do whatever he could to distance himself from Hoover. And even if it meant something that was morally the correct thing to do, to sign a joint paper, he wouldn't, because he didn't want to have anything to do with Hoover, which is very telling of FDR. That's a window of the type of person FDR. He was a very, very shrewd politician. And always remember that. His politics will come before any issues of rescue and relief. That doesn't mean he didn't care about rescue and relief, but his politics will always come first. That seems how history bears itself out. It's important to understand. So FDR is elected in 33. Before we talk about FDR, it's important to understand what's going on in other institutions in the United States. Most important institution that we have to understand is the State Department. The United States State Department. It was led by Cordell Hull. He was somewhat of a distant, FDR and Cordell Hull did not have much of a relationship. It wasn't bad, but he did not, in all of FDR's trips to Europe, to the big power conferences, he never took Hull with him. Hull was, very much off at a distance. Interestingly, Hull's wife was Jewish, but that's not going to pardon his gross negligence and the indifference that they had to the plight of the Jews, beginning in 32, but really moving all the way till the end of the war. The State Department's going to be the villains. They believe deeply in non-interventionism. These were the WASPs. They felt that free trade was far, far, far more important than any issues of human rights, rescue, and relief. So they were never interested in calling out other governments for their domestic sins, because that might, get involved in limiting trade. That's all they cared about. As we'll see later on, they are going to be, the State Department will be the biggest enemies of the Jewish people. The State Department are the real villains. Most were totally indifferent to the suffering of the Jews. Many in the United States State Department were out and out anti-Semites of the highest order. Let's talk about the United States Congress. The Congress at the time pretty much shared the State Department's attitudes. they really just weren't interested in Jewish relief. Some were outright anti-Semites, including Representative Louis McFadden of Pennsylvania, who, quote, endorsed the notion of worldwide Jewish conspiracy and the protocols of elders of Zion. Some were out-and-out anti-Semites. Most weren't, but almost all of them were indifferent to the plight of the Jews, certainly in the beginning, or certainly didn't, at least in the beginning, in the early 30s, was not a high priority. The Republican Party, which we mentioned earlier, they were isolationists of the highest order. Again, you have to remember, this is post-World War I. Most Americans, if you were to poll most Americans, I think I saw 70% of Americans in the late 30s thought World War I was a mistake, and the United States shouldn't have entered in World War I. Why are we sending our sons to die thousands of miles away for some war that's not our problem? So you have to, that's so critical to understand. That's the mentality of the Republican Party. For that matters, we're going to see in just a second, well, let's move to that right now, the general public. The general public, they were very isolationists. This is the greatest tragedy, is that the immigration restrictions, the United States, up until 1924, had basically an open door policy of immigration. Complete open door policy of immigration. You just walked into the United States and said, here I am, and that was it. That you didn't need to show a document, any single piece of paper, and you could become a naturalized citizen. Beginning in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, they really clamped down very tightly on immigration. The reason for that was because of World War I. And the United States really retreated, didn't want to have anything to do with Europe, didn't want to have anything to do with the foreigners, and they really closed down immigration. There were some extreme anti-Semites in the United States at the time. People like Charles Lindbergh, who was a national hero, right? Of course, for being the first person to fly across the Atlantic. But he was an out-and-out anti-Semite. At the end of his life, FDR said, "I'm convinced Lindbergh was a Nazi." He was. He was given the Iron Cross by Hitler. He was a really evil person. There were some really popular media people. Father Charles Coughlin, who had a very, very popular radio program, was a Nazi, promoting blatant anti-Semitism. People like William Dudley Pelley, there was something called the Silver Shirts, pro-Nazi organizations. I want to say very popular. It's an overstatement, but they did exist. These were pro-Nazi parties or groups in the 30s. And of course, I love this. Gerald Winrod, the Jayhawk Nazi, he was from Kansas. Now, these did not represent very large segments of the United States. It's very important to point that out. These were not very large segments, but they did exist. The average American, what did the average American want? The average American had the normal prejudices against Jews, which wasn't out and out. I wouldn't call it extreme anti-Semitism. It was the normal, I don't mean to dismiss it. It's horrific. But there was, I would call it low-grade prejudices that everyone had, the average person had, in the 30s. That's what the average American felt. What the average American felt in the 1930s was economic hardship. That's the real catastrophe. The average American had tremendous poverty and economic hardship, which is why the average American was not interested in more people coming into the United States, more immigrants come to the United States. Why? Because that just means more people competing for your jobs, which was one of the great tragedies of the time. Let's talk about the American Jewish community during the 30s. The American Jewish community, and this is such an important point. This is such an important point. The American Jewish community, this is the ironic part of the great tragedy of the destruction of European Jewry, was that FDR was going to get the Jewish support even if he never condemned the Nazis. He never really risked jeopardizing losing the Jewish vote. Now, that's paradoxical, but that worked against the Jewish interests. That meant he didn't have to go out of his way to do things that were politically uncomfortable in order to help with relief and rescue of Jews in Europe, because it's not like he was going to get any backlash from the Jewish community, because the Jewish community viewed FDR as the hero. So that means, it's a terrible irony, it's counterintuitive, but that means he didn't have to go out of his way to placate the Jews, because he was going to get their votes anyway. That was the great tragedy. He could count on the Jewish vote. There would be no formal protest from FDR until way late into the issue. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to immigration, which was really and this is an important thing, as soon as Hitler rose to power, very early on, Jews in Germany were desperate to get out. It's one of the great myths that some people in the American Jewish community now think that, like, oh, the Jews just stayed in Europe. No, they didn't. The Jews wanted to get out of Germany, but here's the great tragedy. There was nowhere for them to go. This is the tragedy of the Holocaust. For the year after year after year, there was no one who would accept the Jews. Now, I'm not talking about Poland and Eastern Europe yet, because they're autonomous, separate countries. I'm talking about the Jews in Germany. There was nobody wanted them. No one would accept them. Now, as I mentioned, there were these quota systems which basically capped immigration at a very low number. That number was roughly from Jews from all of German immigration was basically capped at about 27,000 people per year. So in theory, now that's a tiny number. But in theory, to the United States, in theory, all right, let's get all of those quotas filled. Let's at least try to get 27,000 Jews a year filled. The disaster was that the State Department really didn't want any of these Jews to come, which means even within the quota system, here are the amount of Jews that came in. In 1933, under 2,000. 1934, 4,392, 17% of the quota. 1935, 5,200. 1936, 6,346. I was talking to my father-in-law today. My wife's grandmother, of blessed memory, was miraculously one of those 6,000 people. She got out in 36. He said it may have been 37. Either way, in 37 it was like 9,000, but it was tiny numbers. Now, we'll see later on, beginning in 38, when we get to the next FDR, he's going to see to it that those quotas are filled. But it should be noted, there was never any serious debate of raising the quotas. It was just a matter of getting those quotas filled. But you see how the State Department did everything they could, even within the quota system, to ensure that Jews couldn't come. Which is a tragedy of the highest order. If you actually go from 1933 to 1943, that probably should be 44, within the quota system, I'm not talking about had they expanded the quota system, which you're talking about the greatest crime in the history of humanity, and we don't have the decency of recognizing that and expanding the quota system, and we're going to see about all other creative solutions that were offered. But even within the United States legal system, there were 1.2 million slots that went unfilled during that decade. Can you imagine that? 1.2 million slots. Every one of those 1.2 million people are my brothers and sisters, your parents and grandparents, your aunts and uncles. Thanks to the United States State Department. No, that didn't happen. That didn't happen very much. But we'll get to that. We'll get to like the St. Louis, but it didn't really happen very much. That leads us to the second FDR, the election of 36. Now, let me just back up a second. The reason why FDR didn't take a very strong interest in the suffering of the Jews, which again, he certainly knew and saw, and everyone knew and saw, is, first of all, he's a first-term president. He wants to win a second term. It was not a politically advantageous position to take, to be like, let's let in more immigrants. The country didn't want immigrants. So the politically expedient thing to do was to completely ignore it, number one. Number two, all that people cared about between between 32 and 36, the only thing that people cared about was the economy. FDR in his first term was exclusively focused on domestic affairs. Once he wins the election of 36, and the big question is, when did he think about running for a third term? No one knows for sure. It's probably when he saw that Europe was really heading to war. So sometime in 38, or probably even more like 39. So in the beginning of 36, when the beginning of his second term, right? Second-term presidents have tremendous leverage because they can do whatever they want because they don't care about what's going to happen in 4 years because they're going to be out of office anyway. So it's beginning of 36. We're going to see that FDR does a whole lot in terms of rescue and relief efforts. He won that election in a landslide. Many accused the Republican nominee, the Republican candidate was Alf Landon, of being an anti-Semite. He was not. He was, a classic Republican, but he definitely wasn't an anti-Semite. But he won on a landslide, which enabled FDR to re-examine his immigration issues, and he becomes far more sympathetic to Jewish suffering. One of the biggest, we mentioned within the quota system, one of the ways that the State Department refused immigrants was there was something called the possible public charge clause, which was someone who is a possible public charge, someone who might go on welfare, would be rejected. So if you're a potential immigrant, if the State Department would say you're a possible public charge, you'd be rejected. Well, think about that. Who is not a possible public charge? Everyone's a possible public charge. You can be the wealthiest guy in the world. Well, what happens if you go bankrupt tomorrow? You're a possible. So it was a very, very liberal reason to reject immigrants. Now, that said, after 36, FDR changes that not from possible public charge to probable public charge, which meant that was a harder one tool that the State Department. Now, by 37, there were 10,000 immigrants. Again, still well below even 50% within the law. Now, in March of 38 is when Germany really begins its land grab. It began a little earlier when it gobbled up the Sudetenland, but in March of 38, of course, is the Anschluss. That's when Germany really gobbles up Austria. And immediately, by the way, immediately when the Anschluss was declared in March of 38, Jews in Vienna were trying to get out of Austria. They wanted to get out, but again, where were they going to go? There was nowhere for them to go, which again is the great tragedy. FDR wanted to make sure that everyone, after the Anschluss, he helped political refugees, and he actually tried what he tried to do. I think he was successful on this. Was to change the law. Is that, well, hey, if Germany and Austria are now going to declare themselves to be one country, we can combine their immigration quotas. Which I don't know if he tried doing that. I don't know how successful he was. But what he did also say is we're going to now fill those quotas, which he did. Beginning in 38, the quotas were filled. But again, it's still just a meager 27,000 people. By 38, there were over 300,000 people on the waiting list to immigrate. It was a disaster. FDR did another thing at this point. He called together a conference to say, hey, why is it only the United States that should share the burden in dealing with all these immigrants and relief of the persecuted Jews? Let's have an international conference. Let's all come together and let's see what countries, what we can do, where can Jews go to open up places and we can come together collaboratively. And this conference took place in Evian, France. It's the Great Evian Conference. It would be one of two conferences one of two international conferences that would be held during the Third Reich to deal with Jews under the Nazi regime. The first one, the Evian Conference, was actually a legitimate conference. It was done in good faith, at least from FDR's perspective. They really were trying to find for solutions. The problem was, and now keep in mind, there was no political benefit for FDR to do this. He had nothing to gain politically. His stipulations was that this, we're only trying to fill existing immigration laws. This wouldn't cost any countries any money. Any costs that would be incurred would be raised privately. And the issue of Israel and Zionism, which we're not going to really touch on that much tonight, would be off the agenda. What emerged from the Evian Conference was that no one wanted the Jews. No one wanted the Jews. Australia famously said, we don't have a Jewish problem and we don't want a Jewish problem. The Golda Meir was in the, she would say, she was in the ludicrous capacity of the Jewish observer from Palestine and wasn't even seated with the delegates although the refugees under discussion are my own people. Nothing happened. There were a lot of ideas, but nothing happened. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is Hitler saw. Hitler saw that no one was interested. And he would say after the Evian conference, this is a quote of Hitler, "I can only hope that and expect that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, the Jews, will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships. I'll send you all of my Jews on cruise liners. Take them. No one's interested." Interesting. In September of 38 is, again, the next catastrophe. That's when the appeasement, that's when, peace in our time, that's when Hitler gobbles up Czechoslovakia, and the Jews in Munich and Jews in Czechoslovakia are now in great peril as well. One woman who was visiting Chicago was a woman from Czechoslovakia, and she was visiting Chicago when Czechoslovakia ceased to be a country and now was under Nazi rule. This was very, very covered widely in the media. She jumped off the top of some skyscraper together with her children in Chicago in protest of being sent back to her, what ultimately probably would have been her death in Czechoslovakia. This really got to FDR, and he issued anyone who was in the United States from Czechoslovakia on a travel visa would be allowed to stay in the United States. Again, he didn't need to do that, but he did. Of course, in November of 38 is Kristallnacht. Interesting, and Kristallnacht was widely reported by the media. After Kristallnacht, FDR recalled the U.S. ambassador. The only country that did that, which is interesting. And again, any German Jew who was in the United States on a travel visa was allowed to stay. It was at this time, after Kristallnacht, where there were a wide variety of I would call them, they were real resettlement plans. Resettlement plans of places where the Jews can go. And it's almost a tragic comedy of errors, or a tragic comedy of indifference. Every one of these plans failed. Didn't you know there was a real legitimate plan to have Jews settle in the United States territory? Wasn't yet a state, but Alaska. There was a very big push to have Jews go to Alaska. Wasn't a country, it's the middle of nowhere, just a place for them to not be killed, right? And of course, the State Department was against it. In October of 38, FDR considered resettlement plans of Jews in Latin America. There were many ideas of Henry Morgenthau, we'll talk about in just a moment, had ideas of Costa Rica, Chile, which actually took 8,000 Jews, Brazil would end up taking 10,000 Jews from 38 to 42. And interesting, the highest per capita country to receive Jews during all of Holocaust, but it was during this period between 38 to 41, again, before the final solution, this is during the sort of the second stage of the Holocaust, would actually be Bolivia, where upwards of 20,000 Jews ended up. So it actually did work somewhere between 1938 and 1942, somewhere between 40 to 60,000 Jews were able to resettle in Latin America, which on the one hand is tiny. That's tiny. But on the other hand, and this is why, again, going back to where we started, how FDR, it's confused. It's not nothing. FDR had nothing to gain by pushing these things through, which, again, makes him so confusing. Many Jews went to Cuba as well. Again, most Jews didn't want to stay very long in Cuba because, for obvious reasons, and it was only a stopover point. Which leads us to now the third FDR. The third FDR really begins when World War II properly begins. Of course, in September of 1939, that's when the Nazis invade Poland. That's when they invade Poland. Now aside from the Jews that were under the current occupation, now 3.5 million additional Jews are now directly under Hitler's power. Of course, at this point, the United States is not yet in the war, but has become much more sympathetic to the Allies. If you remember, first they have their cash and carry, where even though the United States had very strict neutrality laws preventing the United States to sell arms and munitions to belligerent countries, FDR would scale those back, first with cash and carry, then the Lend-Lease plan by March of 41. And even in the summer of 41, FDR instituted the first time in American history, I believe, was a peacetime draft. So he was like, oh, we're not going to war, we're not going to war, but noting that Europe was falling apart. The State Department at this time, the beginning of the war, maybe let's start with the real villain. He's the greatest villain in American history, without a question, in my opinion. One of the great villains of American history. There's a man named Breckinridge Long, Yimach Shemo V'Zichro. He is a villain of the highest order. He was the Undersecretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State. He gets appointed in 1939. He was an out-and-out anti-Semite of the highest order, and he would do everything that he possibly could until he was kicked out, basically forced out of the State Department in 44. He did everything he possibly could to shut down any potential opportunity for relief or rescue of Jews, whether it be immigration or otherwise. As we've seen, the United States was already putting up roadblocks to any forms of immigration. And listen to what Breckinridge Long would write in 1940 in an interdepartment memo. He said, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas." And because of that, Jews died. He's an evil, evil, evil man. In 1940, a boat with refugees came to New York Harbor. Now, this is not the St. Louis, which we'll get to later, which is a different story. This boat was called the Kwanzaa. The ship was ordered to return to Europe. One of the most influential Jews of this time, who's also, in my opinion, an evil man, is someone named, we'll get to a little bit later, Rabbi Stephen Wise. Rabbi Stephen Wise was very close to FDR, and as we're going to see, I think he's also a real evil person. But he had FDR's ear, and he was trying to advocate for the Jews, but fell way short of his responsibilities. In any event, Wise raised awareness, and FDR ordered the Kwanzaa to be given, the refugees to be given visas. Breckinridge Long blew a gasket over that. He lost the battle, but would win the war. He said, fine, but never again. This is never going to happen. And he did whatever he could to put obstacles and roadblocks preventing any kind of immigration to the United States. One of the things that the State Department, and it sounds absurd, it's like absurd, is one of their concerns that they promulgated was one of the big concerns of immigrants is that you're going to have spies. This was a big concern in World War I, and it would resurface again now, is that we're going to have all these immigrants. Where are they all coming from? Germany. There are going to be all these people, these immigrants are actually spies for Germany. Really, Jews who are fleeing for their lives are actually spies for the Nazis. That's actually what, this was a very popular, and this was not this was mainstream. And this is what, yet another roadblock to immigration. Of course, the United States enters the war in December of 41. And by the way, just keep in mind, from a military perspective, yes, the United States enters the war in 41, but from any type of military involvement in terms of the Holocaust, which, time permitting, we'll talk at the end, they had no military presence in Europe until, trick question, you were going to say June of 44 till D-Day. Actually, it was a little earlier. It was already by January 44, because if you recall, they started with the invasion of Sicily and then Italy. So they already had a military. By January of 44, they pretty much had control of the skies over Germany, but that was it. They didn't have any troops on the ground, of course, till June of 44. Patton is going to be after 44. So, of course, as I mentioned with the Holocaust, the Holocaust as we know it, mass exterminations really begin in June of 41. Just to back up, in August of 39, before World War I begins, Germany and Russia signed a pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov deal, which basically they became allies and divided Poland in half, or not so much, but really divided Poland, until June of 41, Operation Barbarossa, where Hitler backstabs Stalin and foolishly invades Russia. That was the beginning of the end. That was the biggest mistake, probably the biggest mistake. One of the two biggest mistakes that Hitler would make was to invade Russia, because, right, Mother Russia, the Russian winter, is so far undefeated, and it was a big, catastrophic mistake. And of course, he would lose. Now, what people forget would be the suffering of the Russians. Us Americans, we think that we had it bad. The American casualty rate was not a fraction of what the Russians went through. In any event, as the Nazis were invading Russia, behind the Wehrmacht, behind the German military, were these was the SS mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile killing units, as we mentioned. This is the beginning of the extermination. That would last until January of 42. In January of 42, at the infamous Wannsee Conference, that's when the final solution in terms of being formalized and industrial killing centers, which would take place in Poland, when you have all the railway networks, and really it's when Auschwitz is born. There were 5 other killing centers, but of course the biggest one would be Auschwitz by a long shot. That's when it was you had Belzec, Treblinka, and a few others, but wouldn't be till January 42 or 44, and Auschwitz wasn't really operational till spring-summer of 42, till spring-summer of 42. So the question, of course, is, when did the United States know about the mass exterminations? And the answer is, in August of 42, there was a fellow named, what's his name, Wigner, I forget his full name, I don't have it written down over here, but there was a fellow, he was a Swiss person who was informed he had informants who sent the first telegrams to the United States in August of 42. The State Department, led by Breckinridge Long, repressed that telegram, did not want that getting out because he was an anti-Semite. He called it a wild rumor fueled by Jewish anxieties. Stephen Wise eventually got that information by August 28th, but the State Department, Sumner Welles, who was on his way out of the State Department, asked him to sit on it, which he did. Think about that. Stephen Wise, who's the quote-unquote head of the Jewish community, had information. He was one of the first people to know about what was going on, about the mass extermination, and he sat on it for months, and not informed the public, the American public, of what was going on. Again, why I condemn him.
We know why.
I'll tell you exactly why. Why did Stephen Wise not produce it? Because Stephen Wise, this is why I heard one historian said, he confused access for influence. He was the rabbi to the stars. He was FDR's rabbi and never wanted to jeopardize that. He was always said what FDR wanted to hear. If you actually read some of his conversations that he had with FDR, they're nauseating. There's nothing short of nauseating, because he wasn't willing to jeopardize that relationship to do what was right. And as we'll see, other groups did and pushed hard, but not Stephen Wise. And he was the most popular guy at the time. And the government was silent month after month after month. Finally, Wise held a press conference in November of 42, but still it was, and this is when it would never really be, the media would cover it, but it would always be in page 7, page 10. Why? Because the State Department would never confirm it. So they couldn't go with this lead story. Maybe let's hold the interest of time. Can we hold questions? So I want to just get through a little bit. The State Department did, because they were a bunch of anti-Semites, they would never confirm it, and therefore the media who wasn't super motivated, wouldn't really push the story. In December of 42, FDR would meet with 4 prominent rabbis: Stephen Wise, 2 others, and Rabbi Rosenberg from the Aguda, who was an Orthodox rabbi. Interesting story is that when Rabbi Rosenberg got there, there's a bracha, there's a prayer that you recite if you see a king or presumably a president. And Rabbi Wise asked FDR if he would mind if Rabbi Rosenberg recited the bracha. It's in your Art Scroll Siddur, you'll find it. And he did, and FDR was deeply moved. He was sympathetic. He was deeply sympathetic. However, the great challenge is we now get to, we're in sort of the 3rd stage of FDR. At this point, FDR this is like his 3rd stage. He shifts away from being actually helpful to the Jews for rescue and relief, and he's focused on one thing: win the war, win the war, win the war. The best thing we can do to save the Jews is win the war. So he really turns his attention away from any rescue and relief, really beginning in 41, but even earlier than that, but really beginning in 41, or 42, when in December 41, he shifts exclusively towards winning the war. And that's going to be his focus. And it's important to keep in mind, the Allies' primary objective was to win the war. Saving Jews, at best, is a ancillary benefit. Always remember, the Germans, of course, also wanted to win the war, but a primary, not a secondary, a primary war objective of Hitler and the Nazis was exterminating the Jews. Just always remember that. The priorities were completely unaligned. We'll get to that, hopefully, time permitting. So really beginning in 43, then the public starts getting a little bit more involved. There was a conference called the Bermuda Conference, as I mentioned, in 43. The Bermuda Conference, and this is what you were pointing out, the Bermuda Conference, which was held in Bermuda. What should we do? It was an international conference. What could we do for rescue and relief of the Jews? It was a completely fictive. No one had any. The United States had to beg and plead with some government official to represent the United States at the Bermuda Conference because no one wanted to, because everyone knew it was a joke. And the tragedy is the Bermuda Conference opens on the day of the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto, of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. So while leaders of the free world were sipping martinis on a beach, right? The Warsaw Ghetto was in flames. And yes, to your point, this was where is it? Shmuel Ziegelbaum, who was a socialist politician, head of the Bund trade union activist, whatever. He was a member of the Polish government in exile. He commits suicide as protest of what was going on over there. Now, there were some Jewish groups that tried to raise awareness and tried to say, folks, we can't just win the war. We have the greatest crime in the history of humanity. We have to do something. One of the great agitators was a person named Peter Bergson. Peter Bergson that's not his real name. His real name was Hillel Kook. He was the nephew of Rabbi Kook, the chief rabbi of Israel. But he was not observant, and I think out of respect for his uncle, he changed his name to Peter Bergson. He was an agitator, a big-time agitator, and he became a quick enemy of Stephen Wise because Stephen Wise wanted all the glory and access, and he wanted to be the spokesman for the Jewish people. And because of that, and he didn't want to jeopardize his relationship with FDR, he was very political and cautious and this and that. Bergson wanted to save Jewish lives. So he raised holy heck, with all sorts of publicities, newspaper ads, he was incredibly provocative. He put together a play, it was called a pageant, called We Will Never Die. It was a very popular person in Hollywood named Ben Hecht wrote the script. He was the producer of it, and tens of thousands of people saw it, and it really, really made a difference. And Stephen Wise hated his guts. The other big group, which wasn't ideologically from a religious standpoint aligned with Bergson's group, but practically was incredibly aligned, was the marginalized, was a group that was marginalized by mainstream Judaism, and that was the Vad Hatzalah. I'm going to take a moment to talk about the Vad Hatzalah. The Vad Hatzalah was an Orthodox group. Vad Hatzalah means the rescue committee, rescue organization. It was a bunch of ragtag Orthodox rabbis led by some of the great leaders would go on to be the great leaders of the Jewish people. It was the primary mover and shaker was Rabbi Aaron Kotler Zatzal. Rabbi Aaron Kotler ended up founding the Lakewood Yeshiva. He was a Talmid Chacham Atzam, an incredibly remarkable. During this time, they cared about one thing: saving Jews, saving Jews, saving Jews. And they raised, again, holy heck. There are stories of Moshe was involved as well, or Moshe Feinstein, or Aaron Kotler, encouraging people to drive on Shabbos, do whatever you needed to do. If it meant raising money, you had people they're starting off there, exactly like Aaron Kotler getting out of cars, knocking on your door, asking you for money on Shabbos for money for rescue. On October of 1943, 3 days before Yom Kippur, so there was the only organized march on Washington of rabbis. It was only Orthodox rabbis. because none of the other rabbis wanted to participate, because they were all influenced by Stephen Wise. It was only Orthodox rabbis. They marched on Washington to raise awareness. Then they spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. Then they walked to the White House, only to be told that FDR wasn't home. He's away on travel. FDR was there, and he refused to meet the rabbis. Why? Because Stephen Wise told him not to. And one of Roosevelt's speechwriters, Sam Rosenman, who was one of his main speechwriters, would say these don't represent the finer elements of the Jewish community. Talk about bigotry within the Jewish community. It was horrible. They called it a propaganda stunt. It was really egregious. But because of these agitators, the reality is you couldn't make Bergson and Vad Hatzalah go away. And Vad Hatzalah, actually, one of the biggest successes that they had was they got the ear of Henry Morgenthau Jr. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the only Jew in FDR's cabinet. He was the head of the Treasury Department. And if you want a great book, I have it over here called The Fire in His Soul. It's a story, it's written by Amos Bunum. Now, I knew Amos Bunum. He was one of the most remarkable people I've ever met in my entire life. Amos Bunum is the father of the Rebbetzin of the Shul that I grew up in. So I met him many times as a child and as a young adult. His father, Irving Bunum, was a mover and shaker in the Vad Hatzalah. And it's a story, it's really a biography of his father, Irving Bunum. And if you want to get some of the you want to get a sense, I mean, it goes through the episodes of Vad Hatzalah, but it really goes through a lot more than that. It's a remarkable book, and it was through the works of the Vad Hatzalah that they got Henry Morgenthau to really to agitate and to call out the State Department. At one point, he had a meeting called Breckinridge Long an anti-Semite to his face, and when Cordell Hull was obstructing Morgenthau's entreaties to the president, we got to do something about it. He told Hull, he said, "This is the first time I've asked the president for a personal to help out on a personal matter." He says, "If I don't have the meeting, the president will have my resignation on his desk first thing in the morning." Now, Hull was not going to risk that, and that would begin really the fourth and final FDR, which is from 1944 to the end. It really corresponds with, in March of 44, Polish Jewry is virtually destroyed, but Hitler makes his one last, from a Jewish perspective, invades Hungary, where there were 800,000 Jews, who, including my grandmother at the time, she was in Hungary at the time, who thought Hungary were allies with the Nazis, so the Jews in Hungary thought they were safe, till, of course, in March of 44, Hitler turns on them as well. Just keep in mind, March of 44, the war ends in April of 45, so it's 12 months to destroy all 750,000 Jews. That's not a lot of time. So time is like of the essence. Time is of the essence. It's at this point where FDR establishes something, the State Department really loses its power. Long is reassigned somewhere else. And they put together something called, FDR puts together something called the War Refugee Board, the WRB, the War Refugee Board, which was a very tiny governmental agency, 20, 30 people. It had virtually no budget. It was all privately funded. And its structure, it consisted of 3 cabinet members, including Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson. It would actually be, from this point moving forward, it would be the Secretary of War and the War Department who would be the obstructionists to rescue and relief, the State Department less so, and Morgenthau. Functionally, Stimson is busy, and Hull, they're busy running their departments, so Morgenthau really had the oversight of it, and it was led, the executive was a guy named John Pelly, who was the assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury, and he did an excellent job. What did it do? It applied diplomatic pressure to neutral countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal to grant temporary asylum to Jewish refugees. It urged Axis-aligned governments like Hungary and Romania. It applied pressure to these other governments not to participate. It sponsored, like they call them, like the hero advocates, the hero diplomats, people like Raoul Wallenberg, people who were individuals who had case by case could, they issued protective passports, established safe houses, were able to do sort of individualized relief and rescue efforts in Europe. They had relief efforts to be able to fund coordinated food, clothing, and medical aid for refugees who were in liberal or neutral territories. And they also disseminated information throughout Europe to tell people, no, let some of the, I don't know if it really did anything, but they would publicize to the Germans, hey, if you participate in these atrocities, you're going to be held accountable after the war. So they tried as much as they could. The reality is it was successful. It's hard to know, again, it's not like they actively relieved, they weren't like active, but they were able to slow down the destruction of Hungarian Jewry based on diplomatic pressures, pressuring governments, and things like that. Most estimates will tell you that the War Refugee Board saved probably upwards of 200,000 Jews, which is a remarkable thing. Of course, the war ends in April of 45, which is when FDR dies. With our last few minutes, maybe we'll go just a couple minutes over, if that's okay, just so we can finish up. There are two areas where FDR receives a lot of criticism that I want to touch. Number one is, why didn't FDR bomb the tracks? Bomb the tracks or bomb Auschwitz. Have a more direct military intervention. First of all, again, just to keep in mind, the United States didn't have any kind of military presence in Europe till 44. But that said, they could have really slowed down a whole lot of what was going on in Auschwitz and otherwise. Just from a tactical perspective, most people will tell you bombing the tracks probably wouldn't have solved all that much. It sounds like a simple thing to do, but tracks are pretty easy to rebuild. However, bombing Auschwitz most certainly, very likely, would have saved a lot of lives. This is an important point, a very important point. Two things to keep in mind. Number one, the issue of bombing the tracks or bombing Auschwitz, according to Brightman and Lichtman and virtually all scholars, was never a decision that FDR made, that never made it to his desk. FDR stayed away from X's and O's. That was not the type of thing that he would have been involved with. That idea was raised and was shot down by a guy named John McCloy, who was also a terrible anti-Semite, he died in the early 80s, but he would write his biography where he would sort of back away and wash his hands and say, I had nothing to do with it, but he's not. He's a villain. He's celebrated in the United States military today, but he's an anti-Semite, and there's Jewish blood on his hands. He was the one that nixed it. He said it's too difficult and all that garbage. It's totally not true. The United States did have air superiority. There were many, Brightman and Lichtman go through, and other scholars go through. They have the records of how close the United States was. The Air Force, again, it's not the Air Force, the United States Air, whatever it was part of the Army. It wasn't a separate branch. But many bombing runs of other strategic areas within a handful of miles, countless runs within 50 miles in Auschwitz, and several runs within 5 miles in Auschwitz. It definitely was a possibility. It's just something that McCloy didn't care about. Why? Because he was an anti-Semite and he was a Russia. He's a villain. But two things. A, it was never a decision of FDR. And many people historically, I disagree. I think George Bush, said when he visited, I think the story goes, when he visited Auschwitz, he said, I disagree with FDR's decision. They should have bombed it. It's a mistake. FDR never made that decision. Now, that doesn't totally exonerate him, because had he cared more about rescue and relief, he could have ordered the bombing of Auschwitz, but it's not like he declined it, or it never crossed his desk to what virtually all researchers believe. But here's the more important point, I guess two other important points. It was never pushed. This was not a big deal, meaning it was never a major deal that was raised by the Jewish community or the general community. It was pushed by the Vat Hatzalah, but again, they were marginalized. But it wasn't like Stephen Wise and others were saying, bomb Auschwitz, bomb Auschwitz. It became a thing. It's a little bit of revisionist history. In the 60s and 70s, people are like, hey, why didn't they bomb the tracks? They should have bombed the tracks. It was a shanda that the United States didn't bomb the tracks. But it's a revisionist history. No one was pressuring the government to bomb the tracks. There weren't mass rallies, even though there were many rallies throughout this whole tragedy of raising awareness, immigration, stuff like that. Where were the mass rallies? Where were the Stephen Wises holding demonstrations, say, government, United States Air Force, bomb the tracks? In Kol Ve'ona and Einona, it didn't happen. So yes, ultimately, does Roosevelt bear some responsibility for not bombing the tracks, bombing Auschwitz? Yes, he could have and should have, but keep in mind, none of the Jewish community was applying any pressure. Number one. Number two, the question was asked, what's the story with the St. Louis? The story of St. Louis is again, Brightman and Lichtman go through a lot of detail, and it seems to be accurate. It's also a little bit of revisionist history, and we know where it comes from. There was the movie in 1976 called Voyage of the Damned, and it's a historical fiction. It's a historical fiction because the truth of the matter is, what's the story of the St. Louis? It was in June of 1939. 937 Jews with transit visas. They had transit visas, meaning they're not permanent visas. They were transit visas to head to Cuba. It was a boat, which the captain of the boat was a German, who was one of the righteous of the nations. He took the boat. Now, about a week before the boat landed in Cuba, most of those transit visas were canceled. Now, the passengers didn't even realize that. When they got to Cuba, they were told, your transit visas are canceled. Now, you bunch of Jews from Germany, you're now stateless because you're not German citizens. So they had literally nowhere to go. They never had any plans of going to the United States. They were supposed to go to Cuba. They wandered around, and this boat, they couldn't go to Cuba. They tried docking in the Virgin Islands. There were different ideas of where to go, maybe the Virgin Islands, maybe into other places. FDR really felt that breaking the current laws and having them come to the United States would not actually be helpful for the Jewish refugee cause. It would create tremendous backlash. Here's the mistake that people make, is that they were all sent back to Europe and killed. That's not what happened. What ended up happening was they were able to work out an agreement where the passengers on the St. Louis were divided up between the Belgium, Netherlands, Belgium, Netherlands, Great Britain, and France, which, again, these were countries at the time were not under Nazi influence. And this is the historical important point. The passengers on the St. Louis at the time, as well as most of world Jewry, felt that this was a good solution. They found a place for them to go. It wasn't the United States, but they were able to provide an adequate solution. They went to countries where they were taken care of. Now, the problem was that several of those countries would, in very quick order, be gobbled up. Netherlands, France, and Belgium would come under Nazi dominion, but that was in the future. At the time, they thought that this was a good solution. So it's just for the historical accuracy, it's not so fair to blame. I mean, they figured out a solution. It worked. In retrospect, sadly, it didn't. So that's how. Can we just hold on questions till let me just final thoughts because we're a little. Yes, quick question. Yeah. 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 Right. The truth of the matter is, it's a tragedy. Of course, it was a tragedy. It should be noted that historians, because it became a very cause célèbre, like something that people want to, they tried to track down of these 900 and whatever passengers, what happened to them. The movie has that they all died. It's not true. It's actually about 200. Again, every one of them is a tragedy. But it actually was only about 200, 230, 40 who actually end up dying in the Holocaust. So it's to clear the historical record. It's like if we want, it's like it became a little bit of a lightning rod, but it's actually not. There are many things you could blame Roosevelt, but the St. Louis is probably not one of them. Because again, it was against the law, and he felt it would be bad. It wasn't. It was. He had. Right. So in other words, it wasn't legal for him to do it, and they found a better solution. That's an important point. That's an important point. They found the solution that worked. So what they thought at the time, everyone on board, the passengers on board felt that they had a good solution. So it is what it is. Maybe let's just end here with my personal thoughts as on FDR, because we've gone over. As a biographical figure, I don't like FDR. I find him, even ignoring all the Holocaust stuff, which I'll get to in just a moment, he was a dishonest person, manipulative and shifting. I don't like those kinds of historical people, so he's not my kind of person. I would say it's not fair to fully condemn him, as he definitely did a lot to help Jewish suffering, and I will repeat what I started at the beginning. He did more than any other world leader, number one, and number two, and that's a correct, I believe, a historically accurate statement. And number two, to recognize within the United States, he was the best option. The alternative party would have been much worse for the Jewish experience. The Republicans were even more nativist and isolationist than FDR was, and we went through several examples, from Evian to War Refugee Board to several of the examples of where he did not do the politically expedient choice, but he saved people. He did, and that said, here's my verdict. He didn't care nearly enough, and he could have done more. What could he have done? People always say, what more could he have done? And I always say back to that, I don't know. But when you're a creative person, he came up with the War Refugee Board. That saved 200,000 people. Let's say he had that passion, that care, that interest earlier on. I don't know what kind of solutions. I'm not smart enough. He was. He was there. He could. Who knows what other options they could have developed? And he cared. Who knows what other situations, what other options would have been available? And I want to end with this, and I think this is an important point. I really believe this is an important point. People say he was the best option. The Republicans were more isolationist, and FDR was just reflective of the country. If he was probably he was more sympathetic to the plight of Jewish suffering than the average American. I say that might be true. That might be true. FDR, of all the presidents in the history of the United States of America, was in terms of just skill set of personality, was one of the greatest leaders. He had one of the greatest leadership skill sets of any president. There's a reason why he won four elections. There's a reason why he was beloved. There is a reason why he was one of the most popular presidents in American history. It's because he was a tremendous leader. He was. I don't think that's an arguable point. He was a remarkably capable leader. And that's why I condemn him. Because what kind of excuse is it to say, well, what were the alternatives? Well, the American political climate wasn't pushing for refugee relief and rescue. That's great. That's being very reactive. What about your leadership? Take a stand. The bottom line is, with all of his leadership skills and his ability to lead the country, was the leader of the free world during the greatest crime in the history of humanity. And I think it's a very poor excuse to say, well, he did more than anybody else. Well, he did more than the alternative. That's true, and I'm not going to take that away from him. I don't think any of us should take that away from him. But at the same time, I think that's a very weak response, because that's basically saying, I'm not a leader and I just kind of did what everyone else did. And I think because he had such great leadership skills and his inability to do far more than he could have and should have is the reason why I do condemn FDR. I've gone way over. I want to thank you all for coming. If anyone has any thoughts, questions, I know I kind of held some of the thoughts and questions just so we could get through some of this material, but I'm here to stick around.